All right, let's dive right in. We're talking about presentment for payment today. Now, that might sound super technical, but trust me, it's the one critical legal step that decides whether you actually get the money you're owed from something like a check or a promissory note. And these aren't just helpful tips, they're the absolute rules of the game.
So picture this. You're cleaning out an old jacket pocket and you find a check from a year ago. Your first thought is probably, cha-ching, is this thing still good? Well, that one question, it gets right to the very heart of what we're talking about today. And the answer? Well, it's not a simple yes or no. It all comes down to whether the rules of presentment were followed.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the basics, what presentment actually is. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty rules, who you present it to, and just as important, where and when. We'll even break down how to calculate the exact due date. And then, the big one, we'll look at the very real consequences if you get it wrong.
First things first, before we get lost in all the complex rules, we need to get a solid handle on the core idea. What does it really mean to present something for payment?
So what is it? It's not just a casual text, "Hey, can you pay me back?" No way. Presentment is a formal, legal move. It's the official act of physically showing the document, the check, the note, to the person who's on the hook for the money and officially demanding that they pay up. It's the starting gun for the whole payment process.
Now, it's really important to know there are actually two flavors of this. The first is presentment for sight. Think of this as a heads up. You're just showing the document to the person who will eventually have to pay, kind of like starting a countdown timer. But presentment for payment, that's the main event. That's the moment you say, okay, time's up, the money is due now.
Okay, so now that we know what it is, let's get into the who. You can't just have anyone show up and ask for the money, and you definitely can't demand it from the wrong person. The law is super precise about this, and for a very good reason. It creates a crystal clear chain of who is responsible for what.
So who actually gets to show up and demand the cash? Well, it has to be the right person. That could be the payee, which is the original person the check was made out to. It could be the holder, someone it was legally passed on to, or it could even be an agent acting for them, like their lawyer or their bank.
And just as important is who you're demanding it from. This all depends on what kind of paper you're holding. For a check, you present it to the drawee, which is really just a fancy legal term for the bank that's supposed to pay out the funds. For a promissory note, you go straight to the source, the maker, the person who made the promise to pay. Getting this right is absolutely non-negotiable.
The law really tries to think of everything. So what happens if the person who owes the money has passed away? Does the debt just disappear? Nope. You have to present the instrument to their legal representative. This makes sure that the debt can be paid out from their estate.
All right, we've got the who and the to whom figured out, but that's only half the battle. The where and the when are honestly just as critical. If you mess up the location or the timing, you could jeopardize the whole thing.
So, where do you actually go? The law lays out a kind of pecking order. First and foremost, you have to go to the specific place that's written on the instrument itself if there is one. If not, Plan B is their normal place of business or their home. And if you still can't track them down, the law says you can present it at their last known address. It basically stops people from just vanishing to get out of paying.
And then there's the timing. You can't just show up at 3 a.m. demanding your money. It has to be during normal business hours. For things like checks which are payable on demand, you have to present it within a reasonable time. Now, what does reasonable mean? Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's what keeps lawyers busy. But one thing's for sure, finding that check a year later is probably not going to cut it.
This whole idea of timing leads us perfectly into our next big concept, maturity. See, you can't demand payment before an instrument is officially due, and figuring out that exact date is a bit of an art form.
Maturity is, to put it simply, the due date. That's it. It's the very first day that payment can be legally demanded. So if you have a note that says payable in 90 days, that 90th day is your date of maturity. Any demand you make before then is just too early, and it doesn't count.
But here's where it gets interesting. The law actually gives you a little bit of a buffer. For most of these instruments, you get this magic number 3. 3 extra days after the official due date before it's truly considered late. This is called the grace period, and it's an old idea designed to give the debtor one last tiny window to get their act together.
Okay, this might seem a little confusing, so let's just walk through a real example step by step. Let's say a note is presented on November 29th, and it's payable 30 days later. You start counting the next day. That takes you 30 days forward to December 29th. That's your maturity date. But wait, you have to add those 3 days of grace. So the final absolute deadline is actually January 1st. See how that works?
And of course, there's one last little twist. What if that final due date, like January 1st in our example, happens to land on a public holiday? Well, the law is practical. You don't have to hunt someone down on New Year's Day. The payment is simply due on the very next business day.
So, we've been through a ton of rules, right? The who, the where, the when. But why does any of this matter so much? Well, this next part is all about the stakes. What are the legal consequences when you don't follow these procedures to the letter?
Yeah, this is the big one. What happens if you mess up? If you're holding a check and you wait too long or you go to the wrong place, do you just lose out on the money? Well, it's actually a little more complicated, and the implications are pretty serious.
And look, this isn't just some dusty legal theory. It has real-world consequences, and it's all been hammered out in court. A really important case, Harsh Chander versus Ganga Singh, shines a bright light on exactly what the risks are. This is where the rules we've been talking about really show their teeth.
So, here it is, the main event. This quote says it all. If you, the holder, mess up the presentment, other parties thereto not liable. So what does that mean? It means anyone else in the chain, people who might have endorsed the check and passed it along before it got to you, they are completely 100% off the hook. Your mistake just freed them from all liability.
But, and this is a huge but, there's a really important exception here, and the court was very clear on this. While all those other people in the middle might be off the hook, the original maker of the check, the person whose bank account the money was supposed to come from, they're called the principal debtor, and they are generally not off the hook just because you were late.
And that brings us to the final, fascinating question. If the person who actually wrote the check is still liable, why does it even matter that these other parties are discharged? What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this. You can still go after the person who wrote the check, sure, but you have lost your legal right to go after anyone else in the chain. Imagine a business deal where a check passes through 3 different hands. By failing to present it correctly, you can now only sue the original writer. Those 2 people in the middle, who might have more money, they are now legally untouchable by you. You've lost huge layers of financial security. And that shows just how critical these rules are. They don't just determine if you get paid, but who you can hold legally responsible when things go wrong.